have you. Here is a copy of the agenda and the speaker bios for you. Take a seat.
Thank you. Good memory.
Michelle, go in there and go right in between. See where she just pointed? Yeah, right
And welcome to the New York Society for Ethical Culture. You all made it up the elevator, so found the room, found transportation your way here, so we're all happy to have you here. My name is Kirk, Collier, and I'm one of the 3 leaders of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. So welcome to one of the oldest humanist congregations in the world, right here. This is the community that gathered together to abolish child labor. This is the community that gathered together to help found the NAACP and the ACLU. This is the community that helped gather together to found the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. This is the community where Albert Einstein and J. Robert Oppenheimer came and talked about nuclear power, both its promises and its pitfalls many, many years ago, where Eleanor Roosevelt stood in this room and worked on issues after the war. The New York Society has continued to be a place where we come together to discuss the more important issues. I had the pleasure 2 days ago of driving the chief of the National Wildlife Refuge System and about 20 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officials around Yonkers. Like many ethical culture leaders, I devote myself to activities, and I am the leader for environmental advocacy. In most of my work, I work also full-time as an environmentalist. And we drove all over the city, and we went to all these places, and we were there with all these politicians and all these city officials and the National Park Service and several other groups to designate Yonkers, New York, as the latest urban wildlife refuge in the entire United States. Now, if Yonkers, New York, which is a big, huge post-industrial city, can put and daylight a river, and it's so great to see Paul Gallet and Manajo from Clearwater here, if we can take a post-industrial city and turn it back into riparian habitat, we can create clean environments all the way across New York. I've seen it firsthand. And so we impressed so many organizations that there was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service there to designate that city and to do that. My ability to work with communities like that comes from this New York Society, that we have always believed that community solutions need to be found through community problems, that we need to use the best of our knowledge of science, the best of our community, that we need to work for justice and democracy, and to continue to do those things. And that's why this gathering is so fantastic. We love to play host to many different environmental groups who are also working so hard, like NRDC, on so many issues about us. Because the Society for Ethical Culture has always been, how do we create the space out there that elicits our best? And the best way to do that is to create green, livable cities and communities where that's possible. And that's why we're here. So we want to thank you all for coming out. Welcome to the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Join us on any of our other activities. We have environmental communities here. This is where the Grassroots Coalition comes together. This is where the People's Climate March was helped put together. I see many here from that coalition. I'd love to have you all here too. Thank you for all coming out and being part of that. And with that, I'd like to call up Kit Kennedy from NRDC, who will lead off today's program. Thank you and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kit Kennedy. I'm the head of the Energy and Transportation team at NRDC. And it's just incredible that we have this audience of activists, experts, concerned citizens here in this room today to tackle a tough, long-term, seemingly intractable problem and come up with solutions. It's really a fantastic showing. And I'd like to thank Kirk Collier and the Ethical Culture Society for co-sponsoring this event and hosting us in this beautiful spot. I'd like to give special thanks to Manager Green and Clearwater for co-sponsoring and co-organizing this, really turning out the community. And Manager, let's have a round of applause for Manager. Manager and Clearwater have been fighting the good fight in New York State on Indian Point, on the Hudson, on clean energy for decades, and Manager, you continue to be an inspiration to me personally, so thank you. I'd also like to thank Bob Alpern and the Alpern Foundation for many things, for inspiring this event, for supporting it, and Bob, for everything you've done for the environment in New York City and New York State over many decades, so thank you. And the last thanks goes to NRDC's spectacular, top-notch nuclear team, which, talking about intractable problems, has been tackling the interrelated issues of the risks and threats of nuclear power and nuclear weapons for 40 years. And there's really no better team in the world, I would say. So I want to recognize Dr. Matthew McKenzie, the head of our nuclear team. Dr. Tom Cochran, who founded the whole effort. Dr. Bamba and Dr. Jongmin Khan, who built the newest additions to the nuclear. Jeff Fettis, our senior attorney on these issues, who's been duking it out in court and winning on many of these nuclear issues for a very long time. And Sarah Lynn Vollmer, who did so much to organize this event. And I just want to say a few words about the importance of the issue that we're going to be discussing this morning. For NRDC and for many of you in the room, the top priority is fighting global warming and building the clean energy economy in future. And when we say clean energy, we mean the real stuff: renewables, solar, wind, offshore wind, and making sure that renewable energy crowds out and dominates over yesterday's energy technologies, including fossil fuel and nuclear power. And the issue of decommissioning that we're going to be discussing today is critically important to that. If you look at the headlines in the trade press and the newspapers today, you see that across the country, nuclear reactors are being retired ahead of the expiration of their license for a variety of reasons: economics, aging, safety, and the like. So Songs in Southern California, the Kewanee Reactor in Wisconsin, Vermont Yankee in Vermont, Crystal River in Florida, all closed or closing. In the trade press in New York today, there were headlines about the Fitzpatrick Reactor in Oswego County, and the odds are that that reactor could well be retired early also. Between 2014 and 2050, nearly all of the current fleet of U.S. power reactors is slated for retirement, unless there is another round of 20-year license extensions, a prospect that NRDC views with skepticism and concern for public safety. And we know that some plants, like New York's Indian Point reactor, just miles from where we're meeting today, in one of the most densely populated areas of the country, are simply too risky to be relicensed. So now it is time for all of us to come together, government and NGO and citizens, to press ahead to identify areas of agreement and flag areas of safety and regulatory matters that might be in dispute, and figure out how, once these reactors are closed down, they can be safely decommissioned. The NRC's definition of decommissioning is to remove nuclear facilities safely from service and to reduce residual radioactivity to a level that permits release of the property for unrestricted use and termination of license. That sounds very simple and easy, but of course it's a huge challenge, and one that presents substantial economic and social challenges. Here in New York, we're pressing forward with an aggressive clean energy agenda. New York State has adopted a goal of getting 50% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. The New York Public Service Commission is engaged in a radical reimagining of how utilities are regulated and how we can get our power in a more affordable, reduced carbon, safer, cleaner way. This is called the Reforming Energy Vision proceeding, and many of us are engaged in it. And in order to achieve these goals, we need to tackle the issue of decommissioning and get it right. So we're here in this room today to begin this important conversation in New York. We have two distinguished panels in the morning and in the afternoon. This morning's panel, moderated by Jeff Fettis, will present informed views on the scope of the decommissioning challenge in the next few years and over the longer term. And we really have a terrific bunch of panelists. We're very honored to have them all here today. Mycle Schneider, author of the World Nuclear Status Report, will present information on the likely trajectory of nuclear retirements, both internationally and domestically. Dr. Gregory Yasko, former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, will speak to the extraordinary challenges inherent in making sustainable, durable progress with the wide-ranging and disparate interests implicated by reactor decommissioning. Peter Bradford, a longtime friend of NRDC and a former NRC commissioner and head of both New York, a former head of both New York and Maine's public utility commissions, will speak to the challenges that state governmental actors face in interfacing with federal regulators and others on these issues. And my former colleague, New York Assistant Attorney General John Sipos, who is leading New York State's effort on the Indian Point relicensing proceeding, will speak to the specific challenges here in New York State. In the afternoon, the second panel, which Manna Jo will moderate, will focus on New York State decommissioning challenges and will feature Paul Gallet of Riverkeeper, Deborah Katz, Executive Director of the Citizens Awareness Network, and Tim Judson, the Director of Nuclear Information and Resource Services. So we're so excited to have everyone here. We're so excited by this agenda, and we look forward to really interacting with all of you on these issues today and in the future, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Kit. First, I'd like to continue with the thank yous, and Kirk, thank you so much for having us here again, and your whole staff was just splendid in helping us get such an extraordinary turnout, and Manna Jo as well, and all that Kit said. We have such an astonishingly august and serious panel. I'd like to get right to the panel. So I'll go right there. So as Kit noted in her intro, for several decades in the atomic age, the eventual decommissioning of commercial nuclear power plants was really seen as an afterthought. Well, the future has arrived, and this week we couldn't have had a more straightforward signifier of that than the information about Pilgrim with the potential shutdown by June of 2019. This drumbeat of reactors, we don't know what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, but I believe 10 years ago, with the general economic sense of a burgeoning potential nuclear power renaissance, people would not have suggested, or you would have been laughed out of a room, that we would be facing fewer than 100 reactors in 2015 and maybe even many fewer by 2030. It's well past time for the engaged public to get started on this process of talking about what decommissioning means in an orderly and safe process. I can tell you, having been to an industry conference last spring, they're well aware of this issue, and there was a lot of discussion about it because there's a market opportunity. So I think it behooves the public and the states to get started thinking about it as well. Some of the topics that we're going to cover today and the questions I'm going to put to my extraordinary panelists are: leaving sizable quantities of spent nuclear fuel in pools right now is what's happening around the country, and this is true for potentially decades. Exemptions from compliance for emergency response regulations. Those have been granted to each of the reactor licensees that have entered decommissioning. And of course, the big looming 800-pound gorilla in the corner of the room: is the funding adequate to cover the cost for the decades that decommissioning will be taking place? And if it's not adequate, who carries the ball? The shortfalls in those trust funds have already commenced in the few reactors that have already gotten started on the decommissioning process. And this uncertainty makes this whole process much more complicated, and the social implications of what is an extraordinary environmental cleanup by any measure are even more serious than with any other type of industrial facility. So, these are some of the questions, and I would like to start by introducing Mycle Schneider. I won't repeat Kit's intro of all of the extraordinary panelists, but please give Mycle a warm round of applause. We'll proceed in the order that we're going. The panelists are welcome to come up and use the podium for the 5 to 10 minutes that we expect each of them to speak, and then at 10 minutes each, I'll give them a yank to make sure we have plenty of times for questions and interaction. So, let's get started.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, for the kind introduction. What I try to do is to give you an overview of how the U.S. Nuclear reactor fleet actually fares in the international context. But it's also important and useful, usually, before talking about future, to see where we come from and where we're currently standing. So I'll run you through a lot of numbers here. We can get back to some of these if you're interested during the discussion. So what we have here is reactor startups in green, and in red the reactor shutdowns in the world. This is the world level. And we see there's 2 big waves of startups, the first one in the 70s and the second one in the 1980s. And it was basically finished with a big startup mountains by the end of the 1980s. And then there's a flat development. I should say that startup means for us, in our database, grid connection, and shutdown means grid disconnection. This is not always the same definition. And here we have the US version of the same slide. So startups in green. We see that the first wave was actually the biggest one in the 1970s in the US versus the world level where it was in the 1980s. So it's an older fleet than others. We see that the last plan that started up was Watts Bar 1 in 1996, and nothing since. But we also see that we had a long period of time, roughly a decade, where nothing happened. It was 104 reactors operating in the statistics, and until a few years back when shutdown started, obviously no new reactors started up. So where does that bring us? It brings us to the number of reactors operating, and we see quite similar to the world level, a peaking fairly early, 1991, with 108 reactors, and since then a flat development, and today we have 99 reactors. One of the reasons why people thought this is still increasing is that the capacity, the installed capacity, this line here, kept increasing, although the number of reactors was stabilized or even decreased. This is mainly for the reason of so-called uprating in existing reactors, and new reactors that came online until 1996 that were larger than the ones that were shut down. So what we did here, we thought it would be interesting to look at how did the mean reactor fleet age develop over time. So we have plotted here the world level that increased basically from the beginning. And we have in blue the US curve, which shows that it has been actually increasing. So the average age of the US fleet has been increasing for 4 decades. Now, something that always increases in age dies sometime at some point, right? I mean, that's not very complicated. It's like everything. So we have had 40 years of increased, uninterrupted mean average age increase in the US. Now, what we're seeing here is we try to put it into decade trenches sections. And we see the average age, 28.8 years on the world fleet, 35.6 for the US, and it's about a third of the reactors are in the younger trench, 20 to 30 years. A third is in the 30 to 40 years, and a third, exactly a third, is now over 40 years old. Just as a comparison, here is the EU fleet, and this is the Chinese fleet, which is really the big exception in the world, on the world scale, with 7.1 years average. So brand new reactor fleet. The other level, to try to understand what is actually interesting, to see what we can expect in terms of shutdown ages, is we looked at what age were actually reactors taken off the grid. On the worldwide level, the shutdown age is less than 25 years. And we see that if we look at the pyramid of shutdowns, it's pretty much stretched out over lifetimes. If you look at the same picture for the United States, it's a staggering figure, isn't it? That 33 reactors were shut down so far in the US, and the average age of these reactors that were shut down is 17.1 years. So obviously a lot of it is due to the early first generation reactors. A lot of them actually didn't operate very well and were taken off the grid very quickly. But you also see that there's practically no experience so far of reactors that have operated until very high ages. Only one reactor has operated until in an age over 40 years. And if we plot this over time, the average age of shutdown reactors, we see this is the world level, this is the US level, and the two latest shutdowns in the US, which was Kewaunee shut down in 2013 at an age of 39 years, and the oldest reactor was Vermont Yankee, which was the last one that was shut down at the age of 42 years. So there's no experience with reactors that operated until 50 years. That I think is one of the messages to take away. What we did here is we try to understand if the goal was to maintain the status quo of currently operating reactors in the United States. And the average age of the fleet would actually go up to 40 years. This is what it would look like. We would need to have actually 15 reactors, new reactors coming online to maintain the status quo by 2020. That's impossible, of course. I mean, at this point, it's not thinkable that you can put as many reactors as that in the pipeline. And in the decade after, there's another 50 reactors roughly that reach 40 years lifetime. So that it would be an enormous challenge just to meet the current, to maintain the current level of operation, of operational reactors. If we take into account, obviously people are going to say yes, but that's not really reality. Reality is that we do have license renewal and reactors are licensed for longer periods of time. So what we did here is we took into account all the license renewals that are existing until the end of the licenses, and we looked what the situation would look like. So there's still one reactor, even if the 5 reactors that are under construction go into operation as planned, etc., we would have a net decrease of 1 reactor by 2020. But it's especially, in the years after, even with all the lifetime extensions, we would have 25 reactors less operating in the upcoming decade. That's a very important point. Just quickly. This is nothing but the 2 slides in one. So we look at the number of reactors in operation with a life expectancy of 40 years. That's the green one, which would basically mean that the entire reactor fleet, except besides the 5 reactors that are currently under construction, would be shut down by the end of the 2020s. If all the life extension was actually put into practice, which there's no indication for that it would be happening, but if we just plot it, this is what it would look like. So we would move the kind of same phenomenon by roughly a decade into the future. Let me make some concluding remarks here, or rather non-concluding remarks, because this is sort of just a layout, a carpet with a few numbers for discussion. The US operates the 5th oldest reactor fleet in the world, and the ones that are older are actually very small fleets. It's like there's 1 reactor that is older that is not really a reactor fleet in the Netherlands or Switzerland with 5 reactors, etc. So I would call it an organic phase-out. So you might think what you want in terms of the reactor fleet or its future. I would call it an organic phase-out because it is impossible to actually reverse the trend in the short term to a reactor fleet that would be young and shiny. Nuclear's position obviously in the power market, and we've seen this in the past few days with 2 or 3 reactor early shutdowns in the US that have been announced, but it's also in Sweden where we had an announcement yesterday that 2 reactors would be taken off the grid much earlier than what we thought. So it's an international phenomenon. Nuclear's position is threatened by a number of factors. It's a shrinking client base. It's very clear for the nuclear utilities. Increasing production costs for various reasons, but also stagnating electricity consumption. That wasn't in the plan. And of course, we have today ferocious competitors, and they're not necessarily natural gas. It's especially renewables more and more countries. Potential factors and this is sort of a few ideas for debate, that would impact shutdown versus plant life extension is, and I think some of these are actually really dangerous. It's immediate versus delayed decommissioning. Like some countries have a strategy where they say, the regulations say you shut the thing down and this is the first day when the decommissioning strategy has to start. So we have to immediately think about taking fuel out and decommissioning the entire plant. And then we have regulations, countries where they say, oh, no, we won't touch this for a few decades. And obviously in financial terms, this is not at all the same situation. So the availability of sufficient funding here is a key issue. And then, of course, the waste storage and disposal strategies differ, enormously from one country to another, but play a big role in determining when utilities actually decide enough is enough and shut down these old aging facilities. Thank you very much for your attention.
And this is very similar to the slide that you saw from Mycle. So what I'm going to touch on a little bit today are just some of what I see, and I'm just going to lay out some of these issues. I think, as Mycle did, just tee these off for discussion. Some of the regulatory challenges and the issues that we're dealing with. The backdrop for this conversation, of course, is this slide. This is a little bit old, the information, but the basic characteristic is the same, that in the time period around 2030, you have this massive drop-off in reactors. The light blue line that represents plants assuming the full operation to 20 years, which, as I think Mycle laid out well, is in fact not what experience is teaching us is going to happen. The likely scenario seems to be plants get licensed for an additional 20 years, but for a variety of factors, they're not likely to operate for those full 20 years. If you look at the hot pink line, that is what would happen without 20-year license extension. So the truth is somewhere in between those two lines. Clearly, we're not going to likely meet the light blue, and we do have some plants operating beyond 40 years, so we're beyond probably the pink, although maybe not at the end of the day. The light green, the green line at the bottom, that's assuming that the 5 plants under construction actually operate. I'm not convinced that that will actually be the case. I think there's still, I'd say it's a 5 or 10% chance that at least one of those projects will be shut down before completion and before operation. So what does that mean for decommissioning in the future of nuclear power? Fundamentally, what it means is that an industry that is primarily focused right now on operating reactors is going to transition to decommissioning. And that brings up a number of very, very significant issues. I mean, the first one, and this is an issue that I have to admit, I stumbled upon in my old job as chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it was really one of those questions that I was talking to a staff person, we were looking at an issue that was related to decommissioning, but not specifically to this. And the question came up, why do we allow 60 years for decommissioning? And I'm going to turn to that because I think that's actually one of the most important issues when we're dealing with this, because if you look at this chart, the decommissioning, you've got to put out another 60 years, right, potentially. I mean, the power companies will have that much time. So from today, we're talking 80 years maybe to go through this process of decommissioning. I mean, 80, just think back 80 years from today, we were in the 1930s, right? So that's not going to be a sustainable process from a business perspective, for so many other reasons. So something has to change when it comes to that. Are the funds sufficient? I'll talk a little bit about some experiences we had. And then I think Jeff touched on this a little bit, but there is this issue of a transition period. How do you deal with these plants that are no longer operating? Should there be changes to the requirements? And this is certainly an issue that will be pushed by the industry, because the industry wants essentially to have requirements relaxed during the transition period post-operation prior to license termination. And I'm going to touch on one waste aspect, not necessarily probably the more dominant one, because I figured we'll get to that. And that is low-level waste disposal. Again, 70, 80 years from now, what are we looking at for low-level waste disposal? Will the current sites be available? And if they're not available, do we have a mechanism to get new sites for decommissioning? So let me just give you a little bit more detail about each of these, and then we'll leave it to others. This is probably one of the ones that's most near and dear to my heart, and that is the issue of the 60 years for safe store, which is the primary method that power companies are using for decommissioning. Although some companies are going earlier with their decommissioning at particular sites where you have operating units and a unit to decommission. The original basis for this 60 years, if you go back to the very early documents, there were essentially 2 factors that the commission relied upon to allow the 60-year time period. One was to ensure that worker doses would be minimized as you do the cleanup. If you let some of the material sit for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, a lot of the material will decay away to much less harmful levels, and therefore you're minimizing the worker exposure when they actually do the decommissioning. The other was, at the time of this discussion, was a concern about the availability of low-level waste disposal. So there was not a rush, again, in the mid-90s, before the license extension rule was passed, there was much more of a concern that we were going to be moving towards rapid decommissioning in a much earlier time frame. So there was a worry at the time that there was not enough low-level waste disposal, so we needed more time to allow that to develop. If you look at those 2 primary reasons, they simply don't hold true. And if you look at the first one in particular, and I have these statistics if anyone wants to look at the data, essentially 80 or 90% or 95% of the dose reduction that you would get happens within the first 30 years. the actual amount of dose savings that you get and worker savings from 30 to 60 years is almost negligible. And in fact, if you even look from year 1 to year 30, the bulk of the dose reduction actually happens within those first years. So from a technical perspective and from a safety perspective, there really is no rationale for 60 years from a dose perspective. And again, from the availability of low-level waste disposal, we are very different today than we were when these regulations were originally passed. So both of these factors aren't there. The primary reason right now that companies choose to use SafeStore or plan to use SafeStore is to allow their decommissioning funds to accumulate sufficient resources to decommission. That is really why when you push people on these factors, that's the answer that comes back, well, we can't do it early because we don't have the money. We plan to get the money, our funds will grow over time, and as a result, we will eventually have the resources. So let's turn to cost of decommissioning. You know, in general, the NRC requirements for decommissioning funding are, I would say, relatively conservative. There may be folks who disagree, but there have been experiences in situations in the past where there clearly were not sufficient funds. In 2007 and 2008, we went through a period in which about a third of the decommissioning funds were below the levels they needed in order to do decommissioning. That was a reflection of the economic downturn, the decrease in the stock market, and other investment tools. Most of those funds recovered naturally as the market recovered, but it certainly raised an issue of the viability of the investment strategies and investment planning. And again, they're generally, the power companies are allowed to use, or only allowed to use, very conservative investment tools and investment strategies, but nonetheless, there is always the potential for kind of a macroeconomic downturn that would impact these funds and ultimately the availability. And this affects plants differently. It affects those plants which are so-called merchant plants, which I assume Peter will touch on, which essentially operate in a competitive economic environment, as opposed to those plants which are traditional utilities and have a rate base in which they can always recover funds from ratepayers in order to do this. So those are very different scenarios. And again, it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about plant decommissioning, the NRC's focus is on radiological contamination, essentially from NRC licensed activities. Reactor sites can have chemical spills. They can have other water contamination, which will be covered under other statutes, which I think Peter will touch on in that interface between the EPA, states, and the NRC. So those costs are not considered in NRC's calculation of the necessary funds for decommission. It's up to the states, it's up to other entities to ensure that sufficient resources exist to cover that aspect of cleanup. The NRC's focus is only on the radiological. The transition period, the two biggest issues really right now that the industry is really pushing for is relaxation of security requirements and relaxation of emergency preparedness requirements. Those are controversial, and I think it would require a lot of effort to really figure out on a generic basis how best to approach those prior to all the fuel being removed from the site. It's certainly an area in which the industry would like to see change. Low-level waste disposal, as I said, right now most of the waste that you'll generate from reactor decommissioning is so-called Class A low-level waste. We do have one facility in the country that's open to any Class A waste. That facility generally has resources to accept planned decommissioning over the next several years, or capacity. 60, 70, 80, 90 years down the road, it's hard to envision that company in its current form existing and that site in its current form existing. So low-level waste disposal will certainly be an issue as we go into the future, because the mechanism to develop low-level waste disposal sites was the Low-Level Waste Compacts Act, which was intended to essentially have low-level waste disposal sites in many places throughout the country. That really has never worked. So you have a challenge right now of, where are you going to put this stuff? There may not be adequate disposal capacity in the future. And then I'll just touch on one last issue, and that is the workforce issue. And there's a couple issues related to that. One, you take the NRC, which is about 3,800 people. The majority of those people work on reactor issues, operating reactor issues. As you transition from operating to decommissioning, the skill set changes dramatically. So just looking at, say, the NRC, how do you maintain good, talented people that you need when you have an industry that's going away? It's not as attractive to say that you're going, to entice a young engineer to come and work on challenging nuclear safety issues, or it's more enticing to say to come and work on challenging nuclear safety issues than to come and work on cleanup and decommissioning and disposal issues. So you have potentially, if you follow that path, you have a shrinking need for operating reactor and safety-related personnel, and you have an increasing need for decommissioning personnel. But what you also lose is your operating base of power reactors. And right now, about 90% of the NRC's budget is recovered through fees paid by the nuclear industry. The majority of that 90% comes from power reactors. So as these plants transition from generating revenue to simply eating up resources by sitting there through decommissioning, you have an issue of continuing to essentially provide resources to the NRC budget. And so those 5 plants that I showed you in the beginning that would make up the fleet in 40 or 50 years would now share the burden of paying for the agency that 100 plants are sharing. And so assuming a consistent budget, you're seeing a 20% increase, or a 20-fold increase in their portion of that fee that gets paid to the NRC, and it's in the millions of dollars a year. So now you have this downward budget pressure on these few reactors to now maintain this infrastructure that's needed in order to decommission all these plants. And so it is a very, very different environment. And again, the pressures will then be reduction in workforce. As you begin to reduce workforce, you lose good people. When you lose good people, your chance of having bad things happen goes up. And then you lose good people, so you get in this negative feedback loop. So what I think all of that points to is you're going to see an acceleration in the future towards faster and faster and faster decommissioning. And that will be the trend because you will get into this negative feedback loop, which points you in that direction. So thank you. That was very fast, but I tried to cover a lot of topics in a quick time. So thank you.
Peter Bradford, a longtime friend of NRDC and a former NRC commissioner and a head of both New York, a former head of both New York and Maine's public utility commissions, will speak to the challenges that state governmental actors face in interfacing with federal regulators and others on these issues.
This is the first occasion in quite a while that I'm serving as my own transparency. But I had a problem. Most of my best PowerPoints are in fact stolen from Mycle Schneider's wonderful Red Nuclear Industry Status Report. And with him on the panel, it just didn't seem right to show more of his slides than he does. But while I'm being transparent, I should admit also that when Jeff invited me to speak to this conference, I demurred on the ground that I don't know much about decommissioning, having worked on it relatively little. He said exactly, given the jobs you've had, your ignorance fully displayed will be very helpful. It's not often that Jeff and Marv Fertel share an insight so completely. So perhaps we should explore a little what they might mean. I attended my first set of meetings devoted primarily to nuclear energy as a member of the Electric Power Research Institute Advisory Council more than 40 years ago. Greg Jacksko was younger then than his preschool son is now. Only Tom Cochran looked no different and behaved no differently. Everyone whom I can recall being at that conference has died since. Since then I've averaged 10 days a year at conferences related to nuclear energy, and that seems a near certainty. Then I'm shocked to realize that I've now spent a year of my life at nuclear-related conferences. Not something I'd want on my tombstone. But that's enough about me. For today's purposes, what's interesting about that depressing realization is that this is only the second such conference of all of those that's devoted exclusively to decommissioning. Indeed, it's the first if you consider that its only rival was devoted entirely to the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant. Even the conferences devoted to nuclear waste have not focused heavily on decommissioning. Of course, when I went on the NRC in 1977, the average reactor age was less than a decade. A few small reactors had stopped operating, including Indian Point Unit 1, but decommissioning them was not a priority. The 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, like Fermi 1 before it, did of course require some relatively prompt decommissioning of parts of a large commercial reactor, but that was regarded as a special case. In general, decommissioning was secondary to life extension, just as interim storage of spent fuel was secondary to permanent disposal, and in an earlier era to reprocessing. As any teenager knows, dreams trump housekeeping. Clean as you go is a refrigerator magnet for mature grown-ups. The long and short of this self-indulgent rumination is that decommissioning law and policy is not yet a carefully developed and structured area. In particular, the federal and state roles are still in play, and the traditional lines developed over other aspects of reactor operation may apply quite differently to a closed facility, one as to which the NRC begins quite quickly to retract many of its Atomic Energy Act requirements. As I left the NRC in 1982, the interplay between state and federal roles in regulating aspects of nuclear power were taking shape in several areas. For the most part, these came to a head in the Supreme Court's 1983 Pacific Gas and Electric decision, which concluded a case that had been going on for several years before then. This decision held that the NRC had absolute preemptive power as to the regulation of radiological health and safety, but that the states retain their regulatory discretion as to other aspects of nuclear power, such as the economic impacts, the aesthetics, and land use control. These lines are not as clear as they might seem, and lower federal courts in decisions related to Vermont's efforts to close Vermont Yankee in recent years were willing to question the sincerity of state assertions of non-radiological motives. Nevertheless, decommissioning has always seemed to me to be an area in which the remaining state jurisdiction is potentially broad and important. As the Supreme Court put it in Pacific Gas and Electric, the states retain their traditional responsibility in the field of regulating electric utilities. And the court later added, the states exercise that traditional authority over the need for additional generating capacity, the type of generating facilities to be licensed, land use, rate making, and the like. And indeed, states have routinely played a major role in reviewing the rate-making treatment of the revenue requirement associated with decommissioning funds, an activity with at least as much of a nexus with NRC responsibilities as regulating on a land use basis separated from safety regulation, the allowable decommissioning schedule. It would not have occurred to me in the 1970s that the states could not take the lead role in the land use choices involved in decommissioning, as long as they had clear non-radiological reasons for doing so. Whether and when the land is to be suitable for other industries, for residences, or in the case of Maine Yankee, for a children's summer camp, is not fundamentally a federal matter, as long as NRC requirements as to health and safety are complied with. I'm perplexed that many states are so deferential to NRC in this realm now. It's true that there are some radiological advantages to waiting, but the NRC's willingness to approve the shorter decon schedules is not in dispute, and indeed many plants have been decommissioned in 15 years or less. Safe Store, the NRC's middle option, the one that lasts out to 60 years, is put forward today as much as a financial measure as a technologically preferable option. That is, some plants say that they need the additional years in order for the decommissioning fund to grow to a sufficient amount. But in fact, the money doesn't have to all be there. There are other ways, such as parent company guarantees or borrowings, to assure that the money will be available. And states that plan ahead during the last operating years of the plant will do well to pursue assuring that such financial facilities are in place. To stretch our topic out a bit, I should note also that the same considerations apply to planning for the replacement power aspects of decommissioning and will help significantly to mitigate the job, tax, and other economic impacts so often cited in studies of decommissioning costs that dwell only on the negative costs. Like decommissioning, the planning for each of these post-shutdown entities needs to begin at least a decade before the event itself. While that's been true as to Indian Point in New York, it has not been the case as to any of the other recently closed down plants, with the result now that there's more perturbation than necessary around issues ranging from climate change to jobs to tax benefits. Petitions to plan for decommissioning now would not be out of place in many states. There are a host of other issues in which states are going to want a voice, too many to discuss in any detail during this presentation. But it's clear that the path out of nuclear power plant regulation for the NRC is quite different from the path in. And as NRC jurisdiction pulls back, the preemptive features are necessarily going to pull back with it. And states that are alert to the possibilities that that opens, and in particular that take advantage of that set of events by beginning their planning well before decommissioning takes place, are going to be the ones who come through this process the best.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Yes. John Sipos from the Attorney General's Office. I'd like to first thank the Ethical Society for hosting this, along with Manager Green and Clearwater, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, Kit, Matthew, Tom, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. And also at the beginning, I have to give you the typical government caveat that the observations that I may share today do not represent the position of the Attorney General's Office or even my own position. In fact, they are mere observations that you may wish or may choose not to consider as you embark on the pathway going forward. So thank you for humoring me with that. I'm going to provide a little bit of a New York-centric overview before we get to the question session, which I know most people are eagerly looking forward to. And it is timely that we have this conference, and again, it's so appropriate to have it now. Even in today's Federal Register of this morning, there's one notice from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about a guidance about how the staff is going to review requests to reduce security profiles at plants that are engaging in decommissioning. And this is just one point of perhaps a trend that folks have observed. So let me move forward. Could we go to the next slide? From a New York perspective, I wanted to break down the plants that we have in New York from those that have ceased operating and that would be Shoreham, and which operated briefly, and Indian Point Unit 1, which, as Peter said, ceased generation of power in 1975. And if we could go to the next page, these are the ones that are still operating. Fitzpatrick and the 9 Mile units in Oswego, Gannett and Wayne County, and the Indian Point units in Westchester. And there is not much, precedent, perhaps there's not many lessons to be learned from what has taken place already in New York. Shoreham, as I said, operated briefly, but its decommissioning probably is not all that informative or providing a norm for what may happen in the future. Indian Point 1, 40 years it's been offline, and that doesn't provide a pathway either, because it's waiting for the rest of the of that site to decommission. So we are in New York, perhaps still, starting a brave new world about how these plants on this screen and Indian One as well will be decommissioned. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we've heard some references to the 3 options. It's not quite let's make a deal, but there are 3 potential pathways. To my knowledge, no one has chosen the first door, and oftentimes the discussion in the public is between decon and safe store. I think, as Dr. Yatsko said, oftentimes there is a incentive or preference on the industry side to try to follow the safe store model, but that does, as I'm sure many, if not all of you know, it extends the timelines out quite far. And by extending the timelines out, it also extends the risk out over decades. And those risks include corporations or some entities that may be thinly capitalized. It includes the risks that may be faced by so-called merchant plants. There's always the possibility of bankruptcy and how that will be processed through our federal system, our federal court system. And there's the larger question, will they be there? Will the responsible party be there in 60 years? And if they're there in 60 years, will they have the money? Most of the decommissioning timelines under Safe Store, you'll see these 60-year timelines, but most of the work, most of the hard work that costs money starts at year 53 and goes to year 60. So it's quite backloaded, if you will. And then there are also issues of how are funds accounted for in the decommissioning trust funds? Are they funds that are for decommissioning, or are other funds also mixed in, such as funds that states and ratepayers have set aside for greenfielding or site restoration? Dr. Yatsko also talked about workforce issues. One workforce issue, aside from the technological expertise about decommissioning, is also the financial oversight aspect of decommissioning. A very important issue, and one that perhaps has not received a great deal of attention. But while we're talking about financial issues here, there are several assumptions built into the Safe Store approach and into the decommissioning trust funds. And one of those assumptions is that the monies that have been set aside in the decommissioning trust funds will appreciate at a 2% real rate of return. That's an assumption. That's a nice assumption. It remains to be seen whether that will hold true in reality, as opposed to in a forecast, over the decommissioning timeframe. And does that assumption of a 2% rate of return, real rate of return, how has that been holding up compared to the costs? And in some instances, in terms of the forecasted or potential costs, and in some instances, the costs have appreciated at a greater rate. And there was a conference back in 2011, early March, that had some discussion about that down in Rockville. So I just want to also throw out a couple of thoughts, couple of facts for your consideration. What will it cost to decommission a power reactor? We don't have, as I said, I don't think the Shoreham case is necessarily going to be informative, but at Connecticut Yankee, to the east of us, it was quite expensive, and it was quite more expensive than folks thought. I think when one normalizes the money out over time, you're looking at costs that were $1 billion or more. Turning back to New York and Indian Point, subsurface contamination will make costs of decommissioning increase. It's one thing to decommission a plant that has not had subsurface contamination issues. It's a whole other thing when there are subsurface issues, and there have been such issues at Indian Point Unit 1 and Indian Point Unit 2. I just want to refer to a 2009 request from the NRC to the licensee, which identified, I believe, on the neighborhood of 1.5 million cubic feet of contaminated soil. That will be an extra cost, whatever amount of subsurface contamination they find. Could we go? I wanted to talk about a couple of other, just to give you a perspective of what also might be coming down the pike. If we could go to the next slide. Two recent, very recent decisions. Well, one recent decision from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. About a month and a half ago, this decision came down from an Atomic Safety Licensing Board in the Vermont Yankee decommissioning proceeding. It's quite extensive, and it covers the ground of what some of the issues might be, what issues are covered within decommissioning. Could it include things such as taxes, lawyers' fees, a whole host of things that perhaps not everyone might think is included within decommissioning. And if we could go to the next page, my last page here, the industry, of course, is aware of this, and they have proposed guidance. This is guidance prepared by the industry for NRC to review and potentially sign off on, and it also concerns what issues, what costs may be appropriate for use from the decommissioning fund. Because at the end of the day, some states may want to ensure that the decommissioning funds have ample money to actually remove the radiological contaminated aspects of the site, and also to ensure that the site gets restored and that it returns to productive use. I think Dr. Yatsko, when he was on the commission, raised this issue. You know, when you're taking something offline for 60 years, there's a 60-year opportunity cost there as well, where that facility, that site is not being used. So there are concerns about safe store, and that it places a disproportionate share of risk on the public and on the states. And decommissioning perhaps should not be a place where host states, host towns, host villages are in a position where they have to make a very stark choice between two alternatives, and that is hosting an unproductive brownfield for many generations or using scarce resources to clean up that site. Thank you very much.
it's coming. There is a wave of reactor decommissioning that's coming, and will you have an agency that will have the capacity to manage those kinds of oversight obligations, to manage that? And that's what Dr. Yatsko put in no uncertain terms. And then you couple that with Peter's observation and John's observations of what are the states going to be able to assume? What are the states going to want to assume? How much will that depend state by state? Obviously a lot. And I'd like to start with Dr. Yatsko, as after having heard, and I think you're right, you had the hot pink line from the NEI slide and the blue line of if everybody goes to 60 years or more, wherever that it's somewhere in the middle. And your observation about, especially as a former chair of the agency, and how it meets its obligations under law. Has it ever been considered by anybody you know from Congress to within the agency? And has this discussion with the states even started? So I'll just start there, and I'll start with you, and then we'll go down the line and talk about that. The discussion on